Thank you, everyone. David G., and I'm an alcoholic and an addict of many, many kinds. Grateful to be here. Grateful to be with you guys. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your service as always. It's amazing all that you do. Dennis T., you as well. So grateful to you, brother, for all your service and all that you do for our fellowship. And thank you all for coming out. As I always say, it'd be a really good meeting with Dennis and Ashley, but it's going to be a really great meeting since you guys are here as well. So it's really good to have you. Thanks for coming out once again. I am David G. I'm an alcoholic. And as Ashley mentioned as well, August 8th, 1994 is my recovery date in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have an emotional sobriety date in SA as well of October 1st, 2019. Really grateful to be here. We've been studying through the big book over the last couple of weeks. We looked at the forwards, and now, we looked at the doctor's opinion last week, where we got some really good information where it talks about the allergic reaction to the body. What happens to us once that we put this in our system? What begins to happen once we take it out of our system and begin to sober up? We have a body that cannot process alcohol, drugs, lust, whatever it may be. We have a mind that cannot process reality, so we're trapped both ways. We're powerless. And tonight's story about a man who suffered from that very thing. He's the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, the man who wrote the book under the direction of a higher power. We like to say that Bill held the pen, the Spirit did the writing. And I truly, truly believe that. Charlie always told me that I think that we give Bill a lot of credit by calling him a New York City stockbroker. As we'll read in his story, he was a speculator. There was a lot of things, but in the 1930s, whenever this book was written, Bill, if you remember back in the forwards, Bill, when he went to talk with Dr. Bob, he sat down and he told Dr. Bob his story, and he told him the grave nature of alcoholism. And the book says this seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. And that work, strenuous work, was vital to permanent recovery, one with another. In those days, you couldn't just pop into a meeting. You couldn't jump on Zoom and catch a meeting anywhere in the U.S. You had to be in a certain place. So what they realized that was in order to tell their stories for the identification that one alcoholic sharing with another experience, strength, and hope would help them to recover, it only seemed natural that they would put Bill's story in the very front of the book. Now, a lot of people have argued this. Bill, he's egotistical. He is this. He was that. This is why he's in the front. Dr. Bob's in the back. But through the research that I've done over the years and the people that I've talked to, the reason that Bill's story is in the front and Dr. Bob's is in the back, if you will read Dr. Bob's Nightmare in the back of the book, you'll see where Bob struggled with the obsession for another 4 years after he sobered up. Bill recovered immediately, took the steps and recovered immediately. Now, if I'm a brand new man and I'm sitting down to read this book, which one am I going to want to draw to first? The man that struggled for 4 years after he got sober with the obsession, or the man that went through the steps and recovered? I believe this is why Bill's story is in the front of the book. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at Bill's story. And, Bill, he's a very interesting man. He has a lot going on. A lot of people say in the fellowship all the time, I can't identify with Bill Wilson in the front part of his story. They say things like he was an older fella. I don't relate to older people. He was a New York City stockbroker. I don't relate to anything about stockbroker. He was a night school lawyer. I don't relate to any of that. But I think if we take a real close look at Bill's story the way we're going to here tonight, I'm pretty sure that we can begin to see the similarities rather than the differences pretty quick. And so we're going to start out on chapter 1, page 1 in Bill's story. Now, in 1994, when I first went through this book with a man, he told me to turn to the first page in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's where we would begin, and I turned here. He said, no. I said, the first page. I said, this is page 1. He said, no, the first page. And through miscommunication and a little bit of aggravation, I finally said, dang it, only in some other words, this is the first page. But of course, we know the first page is the blank page. This is page 1 of Bill's story. So Bill's story, it says, war fever ran high in the New England town to which us new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. We were flattered when the first citizens took us into their homes, making us feel heroic. Oh, that's a wonderful thing to feel as heroic. The definition for that, as I've come to know it, is prodigious. It's brave. It's very brave to feel that way, especially in the beginning of your alcoholism, drug addiction, whatever it is, that's a great feeling. So Bill's, I can already see where he's feeling pretty good here. It says, here was love, applause, war, moments sublime, with intervals hilarious. I was a part of life at last. I identify with Bill Wilson right now, right here. I don't have to read very far into this book to look at my experience and to remember that any time that I took a drink, any time that I partake of my drug, any time that, lust and all of the other things that was going on in my life, any time that was happening, I was a part of life, I felt at last. It says, in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor, whatever that may be for anybody that's here tonight. He said, I forgot the strong warning, the prejudice of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson right here. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. How many times has loneliness pulled us back into the drug of our choice, back into the illness over and over and over? Loneliness is a terrible, terrible place to be for anybody, but especially for an addict. So what are some of the symptoms of loneliness? How can I connect to this? When I went through this book in the Big Book Step Study process, they told me words that you really don't understand or words that you don't really know, you need to look them up to see what they mean. Well, I'm sure anybody knows what loneliness means. But when I look into it a little deeper, I see that it's an inability to connect with others on a deeper and a more intimate level. I've had that problem ever since I was a little bitty guy. I felt separate from you. I felt separate from God. I felt separate from life. And you'll hear that behind many podiums and many cameras throughout. Anytime you hear someone talk at the beginning of their story, they always talk about feeling apart from. And that loneliness, that falls under that. I have no close best friends. I never even practically had a best friend that I can remember. Overwhelming feeling of isolation. How many of us has went through that over and over and over? Feel isolated, feel apart from. When I feel that way, I have to reach for something that makes me feel better. For me, that's alcohol, drugs, that's lust, and the other activities, whatever the illness may be for you. Regardless of where I'm at or who I'm with, it just doesn't seem to matter. That loneliness is still all over me and I can't get rid of it. Negative feelings. I have self-doubt. I have issues with self-worth. I will see these eventually as I travel through this book and I get to the principles part of the 4-step inventory. We're going to look at a whole lot of those very things right there that I'm talking about. So he says, I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. He says, we landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral, much moved. Now, for a long time, I thought Bill was talking about he went outside and trains and cars was flying by and what was going on. But that's not what Bill's talking about here. Bill's talking about much moved on the inside of him. And so whenever I think about that, much moved, it's kind of like being touched or affected emotionally by a wave of entities. It's being tearful. It's having goosebumps. It's all this different. It's this movement going on the inside. And I've had that happen in my addiction. And I guarantee you, anybody that's sat on this call here tonight can tell you there were times in the middle of our addiction when we felt that. It's like that God nudge on the inside. And this is what has happened with Bill here. He says he was lonely, turned to alcohol, much moved. People say, David, how do you know that he's talking about that something going on the inside of him? Well, if you look at the very next sentence, it makes it very clear because he wandered outside. So obviously, this is something that was going on the inside. He says, my attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Here lies the Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier has never forgot whether he died by musket or by pot. And pot, as we know it today, most of us anyway, this isn't what Bill's talking about. In those days, and especially over there during that time, that's what they did. They drank pots of beer. I have a picture of that grave here. Thomas Thatcher was this man's name. And I have a picture of the tombstone. It's pretty cool. So he says, ominous warning, which I failed to heed. 22 and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson right here. I fancied myself a leader. How many of us have done that? Think about even in recovery. Think about once we sober up, once we clean up, once we come out of jail, once we do this, that. How many of us fancy ourselves as a leader? I did that in Alcoholics Anonymous for years. And I tell you, it ended up putting me in a very bad place because what happened was self. And I didn't realize this is what was defeating me, but it was showing up as the condition. And I was following the part, and this is what was happening in my life. So Bill says, I fancied myself a leader. For had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation, my talent for leadership. There it is again. We see self all over this. It's all over him right here. I imagine, probably key words for me right there. I imagine, because that's where self lives, is in the imagination. It would place me at the head of vast enterprise, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. Bill says, I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investor for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson right here when he says these words. I would prove to the world that I was important. How many of us have felt that way? Out of our addiction, in our addiction, the time pride will come over us. I don't need anybody. I don't need you. I don't need anybody else. I'll take care of this myself. I'll prove to all of you that I'm important. So we're looking at Bill's thinking. We're looking about what it was like, what happened, and what it's going to be like moving forward. Right now, we're in the part of what it was like. So this is what it was like. So he says, my work took me about Wall Street. Little by little, I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? That's always one of my questions. Everybody else seems to be doing pretty good. Why not me? Why not me? And anytime that I look at that, anytime that I read this part of the book, I want to look at how many times self shows up right here in this one paragraph, starting with I. Bill says, I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson right here. He said we had long talks when I would still her forebodings, and by telling her that men of genius conceive their best projects when drunk. Bill always made his living by fast talking to slow thinking people. And this is the same thing that he's doing with his wife right here. So whenever I think of the word philosophic, it talks about reason. It talks about knowledge, values of the mind. And these are the different questions that are going to come up as we look at we agnostics and the different things. These are the things that trick us into believing that we have some sort of control. It leads us exactly where it's going to lead him. So he says, by the time I completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grips. Business and financial leaders was my hero. And out of this alloy of drink and speculation, this is where Charlie always said that Bill was a speculator. He wasn't really a broker. He says, I commenced to forge the weapon that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and cut me all but to ribbons. Now, Bill was a guy that would try anything. He had heard of the boomerang. This is written in some of the AA literature. He took a saw and out of the headboard of his bed, he cut a boomerang. He perfected it. He threw it. He could make it come back to him. He did very well with it till one day he was throwing it, whipped around, hit his grandmother's flower pot, busted it. That ended the little project he had going there. So living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. I went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagine, and I think that's probably the key word here, that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and management, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. Bill knew. Bill had been around the stock market long enough to know that in those days in the 20s, anytime you bought stock, you were going to make money. If you held on to them for a little bit, you sold them, you made profit, you come back, you bought more, you did the same thing over and over and over. And this is exactly what he did. But Bill was also a visionary. He knew that someday this was going to stop. The way that they had been doing it, that was going to burst. It wasn't going. He said, I'll tell you guys what, here's what I'll do. Just give me an expense account. He said, I will travel across the eastern United States. I will go to plants. I will talk to the staff. I'll do all this stuff. I'll get all this information. I'll bring it back to you. And I guarantee you we can make money this way. And they said, no, Bill, we don't want to do that. We're making plenty of money. Things are fine. So Bill says this. He says, I'm going to do it anyway. And this is exactly what he did. So there's where he said, I failed to persuade him to send him out looking. So he decided to go anyway, he and his wife. I developed the theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent blankets, a change of clothes, 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had had some success at speculation. There it is again. So we had a little bit of money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year, and at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position, and there the use of a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit for several $1,000s for that year. So once they come back, they gave the idea to the people that he had tried to get to send him out there in the first place. When they took a look at that, they said, oh my God, yes, this is absolutely what we're looking for. Yeah, how could we not have done this? So they gave Bill a great position. He's got a lot of money. Things are beginning to come in. Things are looking good for Bill. But so is the drink. It's sneaking up and it's coming on him, just like it does for many of us. And so Bill's making a lot of money. They're happy. He's happy. Everybody's happy. And he says for the next few years. So this went on for quite some time. Fortune threw money and applause my way. Bill says, I had arrived. And that's exactly how most of us are. Whenever we're doing good, we're feeling good, looking better, having a better time, everything seems to be going pretty good. Bill says, I had arrived. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper million. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part in my life. And here's where we see that this begins to start creeping in a little more and a little more, just like our illness always will. There were loud talks in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spending thousands, chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. Bill had never had anything in his life. He come from a small town east of it in Vermont, and he never had anything. All of a sudden, he's made the deal. He has money. He's making everybody money. Everything's going wonderful. Bill has a host of fair weather friends. It seems to be that way whenever we're making quite a bit of money, doesn't it? I worked in the oil and gas industry here in Oklahoma for many years. Had a lot of money. There were a lot of friends around as long as that was going on. But because of my lust addiction and the things that was going on with me during that time, it drove a lot of people away. So money or no money, it doesn't really seem to matter whenever what happens to us is exactly what he's fixing to describe. He says, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing almost all day and every night. Bill is drinking a little more now. It's not because so much that he wants to. It's starting to be because he has to. He says, the remonstrance of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. They begin to push us away after a period of time, don't they? They don't want us around anymore. We're embarrassing. We act ugly. We talk and say things that we shouldn't say. Friends begin to terminate in a row. We become a lone wolf. He says there were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. Now, Joe of Joe and Charlie would always tell me, David, I believe almost everything that Bill wrote in the book, but I don't believe that. Because if you read some of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the other books, there were many times whenever Bill seemed to have the same addiction that many of us have sitting in this room here tonight. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. I go by what history says, not so much of what people tell me. And I read about that in the other books. So it says in 1929, I contracted golf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be very jittery in the morning. Now the illness is beginning to progress in Bill. We begin to see some of the first symptoms of the jitterness in the morning. Alcoholics who are on here, drug addicts who are on here, and even lust addicts who are on here can identify with this whenever we become very jittery at times. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to roam around the exclusive course, which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I acquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees upon the well-to-do. A local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. Bill's on top, but drinking's catching up with him. He says, abruptly, in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. There's some people on here that can absolutely remember probably those times. Not that they lived in those times, but our parents did for sure. And so in the 1920s, when all of this broke loose, it went to hell. I mean, everything crashed. And I mean, it was just in a little bit over a long, long period of time. I mean, it crashed immediately. And then it wasn't too long after that until the London Stock Exchange did the same thing. And that started the Great Depression in our country. So Bill says, after one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. Now, if I look at that in the first person and I relate that back to me and I look at that inwardly, when I sober up or whenever I'm still kind of under the influence, but I'm coming in to sober up, whether it be from alcohol, love, lust, drugs, whatever it may be, does the ticker still clatter? And I will guarantee you, most anybody on here will tell you, if you look at it in that respect, it most definitely does. He says, I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ 32 had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. And I mean, just think about that for a minute. If you think about people jumping to their death from the towers of high finance because they lost everything. Well, I'm probably going to do what Bill did here if I'm there at that time. Bill says it disgusted me, but I would not jump. I went back to the bar. That's exactly what I would have done. I'd have went back to the bar. I'd have went back to the dope house. I'd have went back to the massage parlor. I'd have went back anywhere because my relief comes from there. So fear. We see that fear is here. He would not jump. He went back to the bar. So Bill had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? His friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. My God, that's unbelievable if you think of that. And then for me to do what alcoholics do and drug addicts do and lust addicts do, so what? Tomorrow's another day. Let's go at it again. Yeah, that's kind of how I think for sure. So as I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. Bill says the next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left, and I thought I'd better go to Canada. Bill was crazy, but he wasn't stupid. He knew where the money was, and that's where he was going, and that's where he went. But he's taking something with him that he doesn't realize, and it's going to catch up to him. And it says by the following spring, we were living in our accustomed lifestyle. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. We know that Napoleon overtook Elba. We know that that's a small island that he overtook. Bill says that's kind of how I felt. No St. Helena for me. But drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. And this time we stayed broke. Now Bill is really going to begin to suffer the consequences of his actions, which is based on an idea that has been going on with him for a long, long time. Look at what he says. We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, and then I lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Man, I can relate to that so much. I had a brawl with many taxi drivers over the years in my disease. Mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work at the department store. We can't work anymore. Who goes to work? She goes to work. I mean, that's just kind of how it is. Coming home exhausted to find me drunk, I become an unwelcome hanger-on at the brokerage places. Here was the golden boy. Here was the man who had made so much money for so many people, and now he's showing up there. They're telling him, Bill, you're an embarrassment to us. Man, you don't look good. You don't smell good. Man, you need to move on down the road. You're embarrassing our customers. We don't want you around here anymore. Bill says, I was an unwelcome hanger-oner. I can relate to Bill Wilson. There became a time in my addiction that absolutely nobody wanted me around. At one time, we had made a lot of money together. We had become good friends. But there's this disease that takes all of that away. And that's what's beginning to happen to Bill here. So he said, liquor ceased to be a luxury. It becomes a necessity now. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s. I would pay my bills at the bar and the delicatessens. My wife's working in a department store, coming home every night exhausted to find me drunk. I net a deal, get a little bit of money. Instead of trying to help her out, what am I going to do? I'm going to pay my tab out. I'm going to pay my dope dealer. This is absolutely, I need a massage. Whatever the case may be, that's exactly what most of us end up doing. It's the same thing that he done here. He said this went on endlessly. I guarantee you, everybody on here can relate to that. I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by half dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought, key words right there, I still thought I could control the situation. If you remember when we read in the doctor's opinion early on, he said there will come a time when we absolutely cannot differentiate the true from the false. That's what's happening to Bill right here. Bill says, I still think that I can control the situation. It'll get better. It'll be better. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. We see that over and over. So many of us have done the same thing. But he says gradually things got worse. Of course they get worse because now the disease is beginning to progress in Bill more and more. We're seeing him head for his bottom. Only he don't know it. But this is exactly what's about to happen. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became very ill. Bill got a lot of problems, don't he? First time I ever read Bill's story, I was in jail. I said, my God, that dude's got a lot of problems. Never did I know one day that I would come back and look at this in the first person and see that this is exactly what happens to me. It's the same thing. But look what he says. This is awesome. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Wow. Things going bad for Bill. All of a sudden, God shows up. Here you go. Hands him a business opportunity. Watch how quick self comes back and takes it from him. Stocks were at a low point in 1932. I'd somehow formed a group to buy. As crazy as he was, he had a group of men come to him and said, look, Bill, we've got an idea and we think that we can make money and we can make you money if you can pull this off, but you're going to have to stay sober in order to do it. Bill says, you don't have to worry about that because I'm through with drinking forever. I'm done with that. So he says, I was to share generously in the profits. Then he went on a prodigious bender and the chance vanished. So this is a story all in itself. So Bill had put together this group. He'd made these guys a lot of money. He did exactly what they had hired him to do. They were sitting around in a motel room or a hotel room, and they were all passing around. They were very happy, and they were passing around a bottle of what's called Applejack. And so they passed around. The first time it come around, Bill said, no, thank you. I'm not drinking anymore. I appreciate it. It went around. And by the time it come around the second time, there was a guy sitting to him and says, Bill, you need to take a drink of this. This isn't only Applejack. This is one of the finest liquors that there ever was. This is called Jersey Lightning. Bill said, well, I've never drank anything called Jersey Lightning. So Bill takes a drink of alcohol. Triggers the allergy, just like we seen in the doctor's opinion last week. And look what happens. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. It's gone. It's over. And that's what happens to people like us over and over and over. Bill said, I woke up, this had to be stopped. I saw I could not so much as take one drink. Oh, remember in the doctor's opinion we read last week, sometimes we cannot differentiate the true from the false. Look at 2 paragraphs up. He can't see it. Now he's beginning to see it. He's beginning to see the truth. I woke up, this had to be stopped. I saw. Keywords. I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then, I'd written a lot of sweet promises. And my friend Dennis, if you would, I would like for you to put those sweet promises up on the screen here. Now, this was found in the family Bible after Bill had passed away in Dorset, Vermont. These were the sweet promises that he had written to Lois over the year. Pledges inscribed of flyleaf of Bill and Lois's family Bible. October 20th, 1928, to my beloved wife who has endured so much. Let this stand as evidence of my pledge to you that I have finished with drink forever. Man, that's a sweet promise, isn't it? Too bad we can't hold up to that. Thanksgiving Day, 1928. What's that, about a month later? My strength is renewed 1,000-fold, and my love for you, January 29th, to tell you once more that I'm finished with it. I love you. September 3rd, 1930, finally, and for a lifetime. Thank God for your love. Bill had written many, many sweet promises. And his wife happily observed that this time he meant business, and so he did. So now he realizes the true from the false. But is this enough to hold him? Look at what he says. Shortly afterward, I come home drunk. The obsession to the mind returned. Told Bill it'd be okay to pick up a drink. Bill picked up a drink, put it inside of his body, triggered the allergy, and here he goes again. There'd been no fight. Where had been my high resolve, I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I'd taken it. Was I crazy? I asked myself the same question many times whenever it came to alcohol, whenever it came to sexual acting out. You know, I've got a little bit of sobriety. I seem to be doing good. All of a sudden, an idea pops into my head that'd probably be good just to jump on the internet for a few minutes to relieve a little stress, just a little, nothing more. And once I do that, I seem to trigger something on the inside of me that demands more of the same, and I'm off and running again. Same thing happens here. Was I crazy? I would think so. But the book tells me that it's the insanity that precedes. That's what's wrong with me. Bill said I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective. And that's exactly what insanity is. It's an appalling lack of perspective. I can't perceive things right. I see it differently than everybody else. They can see the true from the false. They can see that my life is going down the toilet. They can see what's happening to me. I can't see that. I can't. And then I can't understand why they're all over me for what I'm doing. He said, renewing my resolve, I tried again. Of course we're going to try again. We're always going to try again. Always. He says some time had passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. Oh boy, here comes ego again. Here's self. Here it is. Always, always going to come back. Without a spiritual experience, and sometimes with spiritual experience, it's still going to pop up. It's just that we're more aware of it now. He says I could laugh at the gym meals. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time, I'm beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. How many of us have done that? Driving to the store. There's a massage parlor down the road. My God. I think I'll just drive by to see who's in the parking lot. You know, I got friends down there. Not all of them work there. It's not very long at all before I'm in there. And I'm beating on the bar, asking myself, how did it ever happen to me again? But Bill says as the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time. But I might as well get good and drunk then. And I did. Self is all over this still. It's eating him up. We suffer from a hopeless state of mind and body. And this is exactly what's happening here. Look at how he describes it. The remorse, the horror, and the hopelessness of the next morning is unforgettable. How many of us being free from addiction with lust for a little while? Fall back into that trap one more time. One more time. My God, I'm driving to the store. There's a girl walking down the road. It's cold outside. I need to pick her up. She needs a ride. I pick her up, and it's not very long. Well, I'm right back into the same thing again. Well, I try to dust that off. I try to shower that off. I try to do whatever I need to do here, but the remorse, the horror, and the hopelessness of that next morning is unforgettable. I can't forget it. I can't wash it away. I can't drink it away. I can't. Whatever I do, it's still there. He says the courage to do battle's not there, man. I'm tired. I'm tired. I ain't got no more energy. I can't go anymore. I'm wore out from this. My brain, he says, raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapsed to be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My withering nerves were stilled at last. We as alcoholics on here know how that is. That usually settles us down for just a little while. Well, the morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Keyword, a thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Fear will keep me from doing that for a little while. I'm going to turn back into my disease. And it's the same thing he's going to do here. Then a mental fog settled down. Jim would fix that, so 2 bottles and oblivion. Bill says the mind and the body are a marvelous mechanism, for mine endured this agony for 2 more years. I can remember driving home from a bar in a town about 14 miles away from me here. No driver's license. Shouldn't have been in the car to begin with. Dog drunk. got two little boys in the back seat, not buckled in. And I'm flying up and down the road, hitting the ex-girlfriend's car from the back, just pushing her forward and pushing her forward. And those boys are flying all over the place, and I've run off in an 8-foot canal. And it's only by God's grace they didn't die that day. So we endure this agony some more and some more. That should have been enough to quit, right? I spent another 5 years in the illness after that. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness was on me. Again, I swayed dizzily before an open window of the medicine cabinet, where there was poison, cursing myself for being a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. I mean, he's running from this thing now. And it doesn't matter where you go, there you are, because self is with you no matter where you go. And this is exactly what's happening to Bill. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish that I feared I would burst through my window, sash and all. Somehow I'd managed to drag a mattress to a lower floor, lest I suddenly leave. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. But here's what most of us do. Next day, we're drinking and doing the sedative together. I don't know about you, but I know about me, and that's exactly what I do. I do them together. Well, Bill says this combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, and so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking. I was 40 pounds underweight. He's withering away. He's dying. We have seen the progression of the illness from where he was to where he is, and we're going to see what happens to Bill here in just a moment. But look at what he says. He says, my brother-in-law is a physician, and that was a man by the name of Dr. Leonard Strong, and he was married to Bill's sister. And he says, it's through his kindness and that of my mother that I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Now, this was Bill's first trip to the town's hospital in New York City. And look at who he's going to meet. He says, under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Well, hydrotherapy in those days was the use of exercises, and I'm assuming it still is today. You would be in a pool where you would partake of exercises as part of your treatment for conditions such as, arthritis, paralysis, all this stuff. And so Bill's doing this. He's doing this for his alcoholism. But look at what he says. Best of all, I met a kind doctor. This is our first look in Bill's story at Dr. Silkworth. Not the upper part of it there, the brother-in-law. The brother-in-law is not Silkworth. That was Leonard Strong. Here's where he first meets Dr. Silkworth. And he says, who explained to me, though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. See, Bill knew that something was wrong in his mind. He knew. Most of us do. Like I've said here before, we don't have to go to a doctor. We don't need to read the book to find out that there's something wrong in our head. We know. But what we don't know is what Dr. Silkworth told Bill that day. You have been very seriously ill, bodily and mentally. Not just one, but both. Bill said that relieved me somewhat to learn an alcoholic that the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. Think about that in our own disease. We can work, we can do just about anything that's ever been put in front of us to do, but our will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating alcohol, drugs, lust, whatever the case may be, overeating, undereating, whatever it may be. So he says, my incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Wow, Bill knows now. That ought to be enough, right? I know what's wrong with me. I'm probably never going to do it again. Wrong. I don't know about you, but there again, I know about me. And that's an old Charlie P saying. That's not the way it is. Self-knowledge is not going to fix this deal at all. So he says, understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly, even made a little money. Surely this was the answer. Self-knowledge. So we see that the first time that Bill sobers up after the town's hospital, he sobers up on self-knowledge. Now, if that was enough, that would be great. In my lineage, we like to say it like this. We don't really care about how much self-knowledge you have. What we're interested in here is knowledge of self. I want to know how self manifested in various ways has defeated me. And when I see that, then I'm going to begin to turn to this power to overcome it. But see, he doesn't know any of that at this point. So but look at what he says. that's not enough. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. Of course he did. We're not going to be able to stay sober on self-knowledge any more than he did. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my decline in moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that all would end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. They were talking about this, her and Silkworth, outside of the room. Bill overheard these things being said. And look at what he said. He said, they did not need to tell me. I knew, and I almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities and my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. My God, now I'm going to think about her. I wasn't thinking a whole lot about her back then. I can tell you there's a room directly in front of me here, about 60 or 70 feet. And that's my man cave, so to speak. And in 2019, I can remember laying in that floor, dying. 24 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, speaking at all the circuit events, doing all the book studies, and dying from lust addiction. I can't get out of it. And I'm laying on my face and I'm begging God, please help me, please help me, please help me. And I begin to think of my poor wife. Wow. And that's something. I'm going to think of her now. Because for 18 years before this, I hadn't really thought about her a whole lot during those times that I was acting out and doing the things that I do. Terrible, terrible what this disease does, and to the families as well. He said there had been much happiness after all. I relate to that. What I wouldn't give now to make amends, but that was over now. Look at what he says. Right here is where Bill takes the first step. No words can tell of the loneliness and the despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol, drugs, lust, sexual acting out, no matter what it may be. When we finally realize that has become my master, then I've experienced the first step. But as we're going to see next week, the first step without a solution is not enough to keep us sober. I don't care how bad it gets. I'm always going back. My disease will say, you go ahead. You go pray. You go meditate. You go to AA. Hold your hands together. Do whatever you need to do. Pray the Lord's Prayer. But at the end of the day, buddy, you're coming with me. And that had been my experience over and over and over and over. I can't get out from under this. I'm trapped. Once I put it in my body, I can't stop. And once I take it out of my body, I can't stay stopped. My mind always leads me back. I'm trapped. First step says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, or it says over drugs, over lust, whatever your fellowship is. We're powerless for two reasons. Once we put it in, we can't stop. And once we take it out, we can't stay stopped. We're trapped. And so that's where Bill's at. And I'd like to say this would be the end of Bill's drinking. But as we're going to see next week, it is not. It was not for me either. It took a long, long, long time to finally get beat to the point to where I'm willing to do something different. So been a great meeting. Really glad to share. Really like to hear from you guys as well. So thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Dennis. And it's good to be here.
This concludes David's share on tonight's chapter, but we encourage you to keep listening as he answers questions from the audience and shares additional experience, strength, and hope.
One area that I would just like to hear about, if you can go back to page 1, not the white page, page 1, and talk a little bit about something called ominous warnings, which I failed to heed. Did you have some personal experience on that yourself, and what are your thoughts about that? Because to me, that strikes me as such a powerful thing. Ominous warnings, failed to heed.
Yes, sir. Good to see you, Jason.
You too, David. Yep.
Failed to heed ominous warning many, many, many times. Even after I knew what was wrong with me, I continued to fail to heed it. Not so much that, I couldn't or wouldn't drink or do whatever it is I was doing, but the dishonesty that I was still practicing in my life, the selfishness, the inconsideration, things like that. Those warnings were very ominous. All the way through this book, it tells us that over and over and over. So for myself, anytime I fail to heed that, really what I'm doing is I'm holding something in reserve that I may want to play with a little bit, but that is very dangerous. And at some point that's going to come out and eat me up. And so I really appreciate that question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. So yeah, thank you, Jason.
Well, thank you, David. Man, I just love being in these studies with you. You know, one of the things that we've talked about is Bill was raised around his grandfather, who had a real prejudice against religious leaders in the church and religion. And so he kind of always balked at religion. And I noticed here on the page 1 also, he landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral, and all we got was much moved. And so I'm going to share the original version with you right now of what actually happened there, because they mention it 2 times in the story, 2 more times coming up, and especially where he finally really seeks after God. And here it is. This is from the original manuscript that was removed, and this will describe a little better what his first spiritual experience was. Then we were in dear old England, soon to cross the channel to the great unknown. I stood in Winchester Cathedral the day before, crossing hand in hand with head bowed, for something had touched me that I had never felt before. I had been wondering, in a rare moment of sober reflection, what sense there could be to killing and carnage, of which I was soon to become an enthusiastic part. Where could the deity be? Could there be such a thing? Where now was the God of the preachers, the thought of which used to make me so uncomfortable when they talked about him? Here I stood on the abyss edge of the abyss into which thousands were falling that very day. A feeling of despair settled down on me. Where was he? Why did he not come? And suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an all-enveloping, comforting, powerful presence. Tears stood in my eyes, and as I looked about, I saw in the faces of others nearby that they too had glimpsed the great reality. Much moved, I walked out into the cathedral yard. And David asked me to share that because 2 more times they're going to refer to the cathedral, and this will give us a lot better description of what Bill experienced in that moment. Thanks.
Hi, this is Susie. I want to share that when I read that sentence on page 1, that I forgot the strong warnings and prejudices of my people concerning drink. That I really relate to that because I grew up being taught that drinking caused trouble and that it was not for our family. It was not for us. And my folks didn't drink. I think there may have been some drinking another generation back that caused some trouble. And I forgot that, for a time I forgot about that. So that's the first point at which I related to Bill's story. The first time I read it, I thought, oh, I can't relate to any of this stuff. He was such a low-bottom drunk that it's just way worse than I am. And of course, I did have a lot of denial regarding alcohol as well as my sex addiction. And I do relate, that sentence is something I definitely relate to in terms of just ignoring those warnings, because as an addict and alcoholic, I want to do what I want to do, no matter the consequences to anybody else, when it suits me. So thank you. I'll pass.
One kind of humorous comment that I think is kind of revealing about how Bill writes his story here, and it's on page 4. I go to a men's fellowship. I've been going to an AA retreat for many years in Nashville, Tennessee, and we always get like T-shirts made up with a quote from the big book. It's usually just one sentence, but one of my favorites was from Bill's story here, and they actually used 2 different sentences in 2 different paragraphs. The first sentence, the bottom of page 4, it says, "We went to live with my parents," right? So he's married, and it's getting pretty bad financially, and everything else that's going on. This is just kind of the beginning of his bad experiences, difficult times, and they go to live with his parents. I would be pretty heartbroken. I never experienced that, but I'd feel pretty low already. And then a couple paragraphs later, it says gradually things got worse. So I thought that was a kind of a funny T-shirt too. And but it's telling of his story to me because he keeps going, right? And it keeps getting worse, and he keeps drinking, and he keeps going back to it. So we get a good feel for the insanity and the obsession and that's going on in Bill's mind. And like you said so eloquently, David too, he's still not done, even hitting his bottom and realizing who his master really is. He drinks again, without getting ahead. But what struck me when you were sharing tonight too, David, was my question, and I'll end with that, is in regards to lust and being a sexaholic. It was significant to me. So I was wondering if you could share on that a little bit too, about the being bodily and mentally different, because that's such a key part, as you described again so well. But I had a hard time identifying that in terms of lust, because I kind of thought it was all up here, and I would ignore what my body was telling me. And that's one element that I could describe. But I'd like to know if you could describe that in any more detail, and in terms of lust, how it's bodily different and has a same or similar effect as a lust addict in your experience.
Rob, thank you so much. I really love what you shared there about living with the wife's parents and gradually things got worse. It doesn't seem that's possible, huh? But yeah. So thank you for sharing that, brother. My experience with that is, man, I didn't understand it for a long time and really couldn't even accept it. But when I read the doctor's opinion and I look at that bodily being different, that craving that comes over me that's beyond my mental control. And I think we've talked about this before, is any action that I seem to take outside of the thought hits, if I'm able to go to step 10 and to turn those thoughts and move away from that, I seem to do okay. I may suffer a little mental anguish there or whatever. But if I end up acting on that thought in whatever way it is, clicking on the internet, taking a drive, looking, the things we do, then it seems to set up something within me that craves more and more and more of that. And it's just that feeling within my body. It's like I have to complete that process in order for me to feel whole. And a lot of people on here that are not sexaholics is not going to be able to understand that. But I guarantee you, guys like me and you, people like me and you, we absolutely know what that means. So for me to be bodily different in that sense is exactly what it is, because once I take action based on a thought, I'm not going to be able to stop that until I get some relief within my body. That makes me bodily different. So that's my experience.